Dom? Eddie Murphy used to be the kind of name that could make a theater relax before the first line even landed, because audiences trusted him with their breathing. You heard his voice, and you expected relief. You expected that familiar snap of timing that makes worry feel smaller. But there is a quieter truth that sits underneath so many legendary comedians, and Eddie's story carries it with unusual weight. The laughter was never just entertainment. It was a tool he forged early to keep himself from coming apart. He was born on April 1961, in Brooklyn, and raised in Bushwick, a place where childhood could feel like an endurance test long before it ever felt like a memory. And the details that shaped him are not the kind that fade when fame arrives. They simply learn how to hide in better lighting. His mother, Lillian, worked as a telephone operator, steady and exhausted, and his father, Charles Edward Murphy, balanced the discipline of being a transit police officer with the pull of comedy on the side, a split life that already hinted at the contradiction Eddie would later embody. A man whose job was to make people feel good while privately learning how easily good can vanish. Eddie was still a boy when his parents' relationship fractured, and by the time he was 8, the stability a child is supposed to assume had already been ripped away again, because his father died when Eddie was young. A loss that biographies and interviews agree was one of the first major breaks in his foundation. Not long after, his mother's health collapsed in a crisis, and Eddie and his older brother Charlie spent time in foster care, a detail that explains so much about why his comedy would later feel like both lightning and control, because foster care teaches you to read rooms fast, to measure moods, to sense danger before it speaks. That is the kind of training no one applauds, but it stays in the body. And when people say Eddie Murphy was a natural, it is worth remembering that natural sometimes means a child learning survival skills, so young they later look like talent. The hook in his tragedy is not that he failed, it is that he succeeded so violently, so completely, that the world rarely stopped to ask what the fuel was. By 19, he was on Saturday Night Live, and the story of that era is not just that he was funny, it is that he arrived when the show needed a heartbeat, and he became it, a teenager with the pressure of grown men's expectations pressed onto his timing. Then Hollywood happened the way it happens only to a few people in a generation, fast enough to feel unreal and heavy enough to distort reality anyway. In the early 1980s, he jumped from sketch comedy to films that didn't just perform well, they rewired what studios believed was possible. And when Beverly Hills Cop exploded, it wasn't a normal hit. It was the kind of cultural event that turns a person into a symbol. The numbers are public, but the emotional math is private. The bigger the laugh, the harder it becomes to admit you are tired, because tired is inconvenient when you are an industry solution. That is where the heartbreak starts to sharpen, in the gap between the man and the machine built around him. Imagine being the world's reliable source of joy while carrying early grief that never got properly mourned, because the schedule kept moving. Imagine the pressure of becoming a landmark at an age when most people are still figuring out who they are without cameras. Even his later triumphs contain that ache if you look closely. When he stripped the comedy armor in Dreamgirls and won a Golden Globe, it should have read like pure victory, but it also felt like a brief moment where people saw the man beneath the mechanism, and when award season ended without the outcome he wanted, he disappeared from that conversation the way someone does when they're already exhausted from being interpreted. Over the decades, he would return, reinvent, vanish again, return again, because the cycle of fame is not built for quiet people with old wounds. And then there's the loss that later reopened everything he had learned to manage. In April 2017, Charlie Murphy died after battling leukemia. That is not just a family tragedy. It is the death of the one person who shared the same beginning, the same foster care year, the same origin story before Eddie became an icon. People talk about legacy like it is a trophy, but sometimes legacy is what you are forced to carry when the person who remembers you as simply human is gone. So when this story asks what has shifted at 64, the answer is not a headline and not a scandal. It is the slow, unglamorous reckoning of time. The body changes, the circles tighten, the noise fades, and what remains is the part you never perform for anyone. Eddie Murphy is still here, still revered, still capable of making a room lift with a single look, but the emotional center of his story is this: the laughter that made him immortal was first built to keep a little boy from disappearing. And you could spend the rest of your life being celebrated and still feel that old fear in the quiet, the fear that if you stop performing, the world will stop seeing you. Fame did not enter Eddie Murphy's life gradually. It arrived like a detonation, loud enough to drown out the fragile boyhood that had shaped him. By the early 1980s, he wasn't simply a rising comic anymore. He was a phenomenon. At 19, he had joined Saturday Night Live at a time when the show was faltering, and within a season, he became its oxygen. Audiences tuned in for him. Critics admitted he had single-handedly stabilized a cultural institution. But what looked like triumph from the outside felt very different inside a young man who had barely processed childhood grief. He had learned early that laughter could keep people from leaving. Now millions were staying, but the cost of holding their attention multiplied with every success. Then came the films. 48 Hours established him as a cinematic force, blending edge and charisma in a way that felt new. Trading Places sharpened his social commentary, proving he could command not just punchlines, but power structures. And in 1984, Beverly Hills Cop exploded into global dominance, earning over $300 million and making him one of the highest-grossing actors in the world at just 23. The industry that once hesitated to center black leads was suddenly reorganizing itself around him. Studio executives, producers, marketing departments, everyone recalibrated their expectations. But acceleration distorts perspective. At an age when most people are still negotiating identity, Eddie was negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. His name alone guaranteed opening weekends. His face was currency. And when your face becomes currency, privacy becomes collateral damage. Interviews stacked onto press tours. Press tours bled into production schedules. Production schedules collapsed into sleepless nights. The rhythm of work replaced the rhythm of reflection. It is difficult to build an inner life when the outer life never pauses. There is a psychological phenomenon that often follows meteoric success: the dislocation between public persona and private self. Eddie embodied characters so vividly that audiences felt they knew him. Axel Foley from Beverly Hills Cop, Prince Akeem from Coming to America, the multiplicity of personalities in the Nutty Professor. But those characters were curated. They had arcs. They resolved. Real life does not offer that structure. The child who learned to perform for safety suddenly had no room to be uncertain. Weakness was inconvenient. Exhaustion was invisible. By his late 20s, he had reached what many artists spent a lifetime chasing: creative control. In 1989, he directed and starred in Harlem Nights, working alongside legends such as Richard Pryor and Red Fox. It should have been a coronation moment. Instead, the critical response was uneven. For the first time in years, applause did not drown out doubt. Success had insulated him from rejection, and when rejection returned, even partially, it cut deeper than he expected. Not because he lacked confidence, but because he had been operating at a velocity that left little margin for recalibration. The 1990s introduced erosion rather than collapse. Sequels underperformed relative to earlier peaks. Hollywood shifted toward younger faces. The industry that once declared him irreplaceable began exploring alternatives. This is the paradox of fame. The same system that elevates you thrives on novelty. Eddie understood this pattern intuitively. He had grown up in environments where permanence was an illusion. Still, knowing something intellectually does not blunt the emotional impact of experiencing it. Compounding the professional shifts were tabloid storms that compressed complex, personal moments into sensational headlines. Late-night incidents, misinterpreted narratives, and the media's appetite for spectacle reminded him that adoration and scrutiny are twins. The public rarely separates the performer from the person. Every misstep is amplified. Every silence is interpreted. Eddie did something that many high-profile entertainers resist. He stepped back. He reduced appearances. He allowed distance to do what constant exposure never could: restore proportion. Yet retreat did not mean disappearance. Reinvention became his strategy. In 1996, the Nutty Professor revealed a different dimension of his artistry. Playing multiple characters was not just a technical flex, it was a metaphor. It suggested a man accustomed to inhabiting many roles, some comedic, some grotesque, some tender. It reminded audiences that his range extended beyond fast-talking charm. Then came Shrek, where his voice as Donkey reached a new generation. Children who had never seen his early stand-up routines laughed at lines delivered through animation. His humor evolved from edge to inheritance. In 2006, Dreamgirls offered perhaps his most emotionally exposed performance. As James Thunder Early, he portrayed ambition unraveling into vulnerability. The role earned him a Golden Globe and an Academy Award nomination. Critics called it transformative. For a moment, the industry saw not just the comic genius, but the dramatic depth that had always been present beneath the timing. Yet awards recognition is a double-edged instrument. Anticipation builds narratives. Narratives create expectation. Expectation breeds disappointment when outcomes diverge. When the Oscar did not materialize, he left early. Not in anger, but in fatigue. The cycle of validation had grown heavy. By his 40s, Eddie Murphy had already lived several artistic lifetimes. He had been the young disruptor, the box office king, the embattled celebrity, the animated voice, the dramatic contender. Each chapter layered experience onto a foundation built in childhood instability. What emerges in examining this period is not a portrait of decline, but a study in adaptation. He learned to recalibrate when the noise grew overwhelming. He learned that visibility is not synonymous with value. He learned that stepping away can preserve what constant engagement erodes. The heartbreak embedded in these years is subtle. It is not a dramatic collapse or a scandal that defines them. It is the realization that sustaining greatness requires sacrificing parts of yourself that the public never sees. The boy who once used laughter to secure belonging had become a global institution. But institutions are not allowed to rest. At 64, when we look back at the height of his ascent, what stands out is not only the magnitude of his achievements, but the psychological endurance required to survive them. The spotlight gave him everything except stillness, and it would take decades before he learned how to reclaim that for himself. Success can protect you from poverty. It cannot protect you from distance. By the time Eddie Murphy entered his 30s, he had already secured what most entertainers spend entire careers chasing: wealth, recognition, influence, and cultural permanence. But there is a structural flaw in meteoric fame. It expands your external world while quietly thinning your internal one. For Eddie, the early 1990s were not defined by collapse. They were defined by imbalance. His relationship with Nicole Mitchell began at a moment when he was powerful but privately tired. She did not enter his life as a fan orbiting a legend. She met him as a man navigating an industry that never stopped asking. That distinction mattered. In 1993, they married in a lavish ceremony that the press framed as royalty meeting Hollywood. Yet behind the spectacle was something simpler. Two people hoping stability could exist alongside momentum. Over the next 13 years, they would welcome 5 children together. The public saw the mansion, the red carpets, the family portraits. What they did not see was the pressure of maintaining intimacy while one partner remained tethered to a billion-dollar expectation engine. Eddie had spent his entire adult life moving. From stand-up stages to film sets, from premieres to production offices, from promotional tours to writing sessions, stillness was foreign territory. Fatherhood changed his emotional geometry. Holding his first child reframed scale. Applause shrinks when compared to the quiet weight of a newborn in your arms. For someone whose childhood included foster care and loss, building a large family was not vanity. It was correction. He wanted presence to replace absence. Yet intention does not automatically create balance. The late 1990s and early 2000s were professionally relentless. The Nutty Professor had already proven he could reinvent himself through technical range. Dr. Dolittle solidified his family-friendly transition. Then Shrek reintroduced him to global audiences in a new form, transforming his voice into an intergenerational bridge. Studios depend on reliability, and Eddie Murphy was still that. Reliable box office, reliable brand, reliable name recognition. Reliability, however, often comes at the cost of spontaneity at home. Nicole became the structural anchor. School routines, medical appointments, social rhythms, the invisible architecture of raising children. Eddie returned from sets and premieres to a household already in motion. When two lives operate at different velocities long enough, friction turns into distance without either party intending harm. Their separation in 2006 was not explosive. It was procedural. No public scandal detonated the marriage. Instead, the erosion of rhythm did what drama did not. After 13 years, they divorced. Reports described the settlement as one of the largest in Hollywood at the time, but money rarely explains emotional outcomes. The more revealing detail is that they prioritized co-parenting. That decision suggests clarity rather than chaos. The period following his divorce placed Eddie in unfamiliar emotional territory. He had constructed stability through family structure, and now that structure shifted. During this transitional phase, he briefly entered a high-profile relationship with Mel B. What began as intensity quickly became volatility. Their relationship unfolded under intense media scrutiny. When Mel B became pregnant, public narratives accelerated faster than private conversations could stabilize. Questions about paternity were litigated in headlines before being resolved through DNA confirmation. For a man who had spent decades navigating public interpretation, this chapter exposed how quickly private misalignment becomes spectacle. The birth of their daughter, Angel Iris, in 2007 became a turning point not because of scandal, but because of consequence. Fatherhood does not pause for public discomfort. The reality of a child reframes ego. Over time, co-parenting replaced confrontation. The lesson embedded in that chapter was not about image management. It was about responsibility. Eddie would later describe growth, not in terms of career trajectory, but in terms of presence. Showing up became a discipline. The emotional landscape of this era deepened again in 2017 when his brother Charlie Murphy died after battling leukemia. To understand the weight of this loss, one must return to their shared origin. Foster care, Brooklyn's scarcity, early improvisations as protection. Charlie was not merely a sibling. He was a witness to the beginning. Fame recontextualizes your identity, but only a few people remember you before the spotlight. Losing that memory keeper reorganizes the self. Eddie did not perform grief publicly. He withdrew. Silence became protection again, the same instinct forged in childhood. Those close to him described a shift, less urgency, more deliberation. Parallel to these personal recalibrations was a quieter romantic evolution. After brief relationships that did not stabilize long-term, Eddie met Paige Butcher. Unlike earlier relationships that unfolded under maximum visibility, this one developed in relative privacy. Paige was not embedded in the machinery of American celebrity culture in the same way. Their dynamic emphasized normalcy over spectacle. In 2016, they welcomed a daughter, Izzy. In 2018, their son Max was born, named in part to honor Charlie's memory. Naming is symbolic architecture. It suggests continuity. By his early 50s, Eddie Murphy was father to 10 children. That statistic often appears as trivia, but structurally it reveals something more nuanced. An adult who built abundance where childhood once held instability. The arc from foster care to a full household reframes his public narrative. His later interviews emphasized routine, early mornings, fitness discipline, time with family, selective project choices. The hunger of his youth transformed into selectivity. He no longer needed to accept every opportunity. Net worth estimates place him around $200 million, but wealth is less interesting than autonomy. Autonomy allows boundaries. Professionally, he reemerged with strategic precision. Dolomite Is My Name showcased his willingness to celebrate outsider perseverance, a thematic mirror of his own journey. The performance earned critical acclaim and award nominations. His return as Saturday Night Live decades after first saving it functioned as historical closure. The Mark Twain Prize for American Humor in 2015 formalized his cultural impact. Yet none of these accolades appear to define his current center of gravity. At 64, Eddie Murphy embodies a paradox. He is both monument and man. The tragedy in his story is not downfall. It is the decades-long negotiation between performance and personhood. He mastered the mechanics of laughter early because survival required it. The world rewarded that mastery with scale beyond imagination. But scale amplifies pressure. Relationships tested his ability to be present without performing. Fatherhood forced him to measure success differently. Grief reintroduced humility. Love, in its quieter later form, offered structure rather than intensity. What emerges in examining this third chapter is not a broken icon, but a recalibrated human being. He did not implode under fame. He adapted. He did not disappear after loss. He slowed. He did not allow scandal to define his paternal role. He adjusted. For a figure who once dominated global box offices, the most revealing transformation may be his embrace of restraint. The boy who learned to command rooms has grown into a man comfortable leaving some of them. And in that restraint, the outline of something rare appears. Not the hunger to remain the funniest man alive, but the intention to remain fully alive, with or without applause. By the mid-2000s, Eddie Murphy had already experienced what most performers never reach: meteoric ascent, critical doubt, reinvention, public scrutiny, and personal recalibration. But what often goes unnoticed in narratives about fame is the psychological aftershock. When the velocity slows, even slightly, the silence can feel louder than the applause ever did. And for Eddie, that silence became both a reckoning and a revelation. After his divorce from Nicole Mitchell, after the turbulence surrounding his brief relationship with Mel B, and after years of being the gravitational center of blockbuster cinema, Eddie entered a period that did not look dramatic from the outside. There were no collapses, no public breakdowns, no sensational implosions. Instead, there was something far more complex: recalibration without spectacle. For decades, he had been an economic engine. From Beverly Hills Cop to Coming to America, from the Nutty Professor to Shrek, his presence alone could move hundreds of millions of dollars globally. Studios built release calendars around him. Entire marketing strategies leaned on his timing, his face, his voice. But when your career becomes infrastructure, you risk becoming machinery. Machinery does not rest. Machinery performs. And Eddie had been performing since childhood. What shifted in his 40s and 50s was not talent. It was appetite. He no longer needed to prove range. He had already demonstrated it. Comedian, dramatic actor, voice artist, producer. What he began to crave instead was control. Control over pace. Control over exposure. Control over proximity. This was not retreat born of failure. It was retreat born of awareness. Hollywood is structurally built on cycles of urgency. You are either ascending, peaking, declining, or reinventing. Rarely are you allowed to simply exist. Eddie disrupted that rhythm by choosing absence when the industry expected constant visibility. He stepped away from the kind of relentless output that had defined his 20s and 30s. Projects became selective. Appearances became deliberate. There is something profoundly destabilizing about being told, at 21, that you are indispensable, because eventually the industry proves that no one is. Eddie had watched younger faces rotate through the same system that once revolved around him. He understood the transaction. The industry rewards novelty. Audiences evolve. Cultural tastes shift. But permanence is rarely about constant dominance. It is about structural endurance. His later projects reflect that strategic maturity. Instead of chasing box office dominance, he leaned into narrative resonance. Dolomite Is My Name was not a high-risk blockbuster gamble. It was a character study about persistence and outsider creativity, an unmistakable thematic parallel to his own career. The film received strong critical acclaim and reminded audiences that Eddie Murphy's comedic intelligence had always been layered with emotional depth. But professional recalibration was only part of the shift. The deeper transformation unfolded in his private life. By the time he entered his 50s, Eddie Murphy was father to a large and complex family structure. 10 children across different chapters of his life meant that fatherhood was no longer symbolic. It was logistical, emotional, constant. And unlike earlier decades, he now had the autonomy to choose presence over perpetual motion. The boy who once rode late-night trains into Manhattan for 5-minute sets now measured time differently. School events replaced red carpets. Early mornings replaced after-parties. Fitness routines replaced industry dinners. Aging did not frighten him, it clarified him. Then came 2017. The death of Charlie Murphy did not simply represent loss. It represented a rupture in origin memory. Charlie was not just a brother. He was a co-architect of survival. Foster homes, Brooklyn's scarcity, early laughter as protection. Charlie understood Eddie before fame assigned him mythology. When Charlie died after battling leukemia, Eddie did not perform grief publicly. There were no extended interviews, no emotional monologues. Instead, there was quiet. That quiet was not indifference. It was internal restructuring. Losing the one person who remembers who you were before the world told you who you are changes the architecture of identity. In interviews years later, Eddie's tone carried less velocity. His humor remained sharp, but his cadence slowed. There was more reflection than deflection, more grounded stillness than kinetic defiance. And this is where the tragedy embedded in his story becomes subtle rather than sensational. The tragedy is not downfall. The tragedy is cumulative weight. Childhood instability, early loss, foster care, sudden fame, industrial expectation, marital erosion, public controversy, sibling death, the pressure of legacy. None of these events individually destroyed him, but together they required adaptation at a scale most people never experience. By 64, Eddie Murphy does not project the hunger of his 20s. He projects calibration. His estimated net worth, often cited around $200 million, is less a symbol of excess and more a symbol of insulation. Wealth now functions as boundary, not display. He owns property in Beverly Hills and beyond, including a private island in the Bahamas, but those spaces operate as retreat, not performance. He no longer needs to dominate the cultural conversation to validate relevance. He answers when it matters. He declines when it doesn't. There's a quiet discipline in that. Aging for a public figure is often framed as decline. For Eddie, it appears more like consolidation. He is not chasing scale. He is protecting stability. He is not expanding empire. He is reinforcing foundation. The laughter that once detonated arenas has softened, but it has not disappeared. It has relocated from global stages to family rooms, from premieres to private dinners, from scripted punchlines to bedtime stories. The boy who learned to survive by making others laugh has become a man who understands he no longer needs to perform to be seen. That realization is not flashy. It does not trend. It does not dominate headlines. But it may be the most profound shift of all. And perhaps that is why, at 64, the story feels heartbreaking in a way that cannot be reduced to scandal or failure. It is heartbreaking because it reveals the cost of being everyone's joy for decades. It is heartbreaking because behind every legendary punchline was a child who once feared disappearing. And it is quietly powerful because he did not disappear. He endured. There is a point in every long life when success stops being about accumulation and starts becoming about subtraction. Not subtraction of wealth, but subtraction of noise. Subtraction of ego. Subtraction of the constant need to be seen. For Eddie Murphy, that point did not arrive in a dramatic public collapse. It arrived slowly, almost invisibly, as maturity replaced velocity. By the early 2010s, the cultural narrative around him had shifted. He was no longer the 23-year-old who had redefined global box office through Beverly Hills Cop. He was no longer the unstoppable comedic shapeshifter of a Nutty Professor. He was a veteran, a legacy figure, a man whose impact was already cemented in film history. And legacy is a complicated space to occupy. When you are rising, the world pushes you forward. When you peak, the world celebrates you. But when you become a monument, the world expects you to remain frozen in your prime. Audiences want the same energy, the same sharpness, the same cultural electricity. They rarely account for time, grief, fatherhood, and psychological evolution. Eddie understood this instinctively. He had lived long enough inside the industry to know that relevance is cyclical. So instead of fighting the cycle, he reframed it. Rather than chasing every offer, he began to cure it. Rather than proving he was still dominant, he began choosing projects that resonated personally. The industry interpreted this as slowing down. In reality, it was strategic pacing. His return to Saturday Night Live decades after first transforming, it was not just nostalgic fan service. It was closure, a full-circle moment. The young man who once saved the show had returned not as a desperate veteran seeking validation, but as an elder statesman being acknowledged. And when he received the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor in 2015, it functioned as institutional confirmation. Not hype, not trend, recognition of endurance. But while professional honors accumulated, something deeper was unfolding in his private architecture. Eddie Murphy is the father of 10 children. That fact alone restructures daily life. 10 schedules, 10 personalities, 10 evolving identities. The logistics of that alone require stability and presence. The emotional bandwidth required to show up for each child reshapes priorities. Earlier in his career, fatherhood existed alongside momentum. Now, fatherhood became central. He has spoken openly about wanting his children to feel secure in ways he did not always experience growing up. Foster care leaves imprint. Absence leaves imprint. Fame leaves imprint. He understood that inheritance is not only financial, it is emotional. With Paige Butcher, his long-term partner, he found something less combustible than earlier relationships. Their dynamic has been notably private. No tabloid wars. No high-drama headlines. Their children, Izzy and Max, arrived during a period when Eddie was no longer chasing external proof. Naming his son Max in part to honor his late brother Charlie Murphy reveals something profound. Continuity mattered more than spectacle. Charlie's death in 2017 had reorganized him. Grief at midlife hits differently than early loss. When you lose someone who knew you before the mythology, the past feels closer. It collapses distance. The Brooklyn foster homes, the early stand-up nights, the Hunger years. Charlie was a living archive of those chapters. Without him, Eddie had to carry those memories alone. And perhaps that is where the emotional weight of his later years crystallizes. It is not that he faded. It is that he consolidated. He owns significant property, including an expansive Beverly Hills residence and additional real estate holdings. Reports often mention a private island in the Bahamas. But unlike younger celebrities who weaponize wealth for visibility, Eddie's assets function as insulation. Space to breathe. Space to choose. Space to decline. His estimated net worth, frequently cited around $200 million, represents not excess, but leverage. The ability to say no. The ability to prioritize health. The ability to spend mornings with children rather than in boardrooms negotiating urgency. Aging has softened his physical presence, but it has sharpened his philosophical one. In interviews, his tone carries less defensive humor and more reflective clarity. He no longer seems compelled to dominate a room. He seems content occupying it. And that may be the most radical transformation of all. For decades, his identity was built on commanding attention. Now, he appears comfortable allowing silence to exist without filling it. The tragedy woven into his narrative is not the kind that ends careers or headlines tabloids. It is cumulative. It is the weight of being everyone's relief for 40 years while privately absorbing loss, pressure, and expectation. It is the emotional cost of turning survival mechanisms into global entertainment. At 64, Eddie Murphy does not project desperation to remain culturally central. He projects calibration. He chooses projects like Dolomite Is My Name not because they guarantee dominance, but because they align with identity. He appears less concerned with competing against younger stars and more concerned with honoring the version of himself that survived early instability. There is something quietly heartbreaking about realizing that the man who once electrified arenas learned to value quiet rooms more. The boy who performed to avoid disappearing has become a man who understands he does not disappear when he rests. And in that understanding lies the final emotional layer of this chapter. He did not burn out. He did not implode. He did not self-destruct under the weight of fame. He endured long enough to outgrow the need for it. That endurance may not generate viral headlines, but it may be the rarest achievement in Hollywood. And as the world watches him at 64, no longer racing, no longer proving, no longer exploding across screens with the same urgency, what they are witnessing is not decline. They are witnessing resolution. The laughter remains, but now it belongs to him first. There's a quiet stage of life that rarely gets documented in celebrity biographies. It is the phase after conquest, after scandal, after redemption arcs and comeback headlines. It is the stretch where the world has already decided who you are, but you are still deciding who you want to be. For Eddie Murphy, part Sao of his life unfolds in that space, beyond domination, beyond apology, beyond reinvention. At 64, the public version of Eddie Murphy is stable, financially secure, culturally immortal. But immortality is a strange burden. Once you become an icon, you're no longer allowed to evolve without commentary. Every wrinkle becomes a narrative. Every pause becomes speculation. Every new project becomes a referendum on your legacy. And yet, Eddie no longer seems interested in defending his mythology. That shift matters. In earlier decades, he operated inside velocity. Stand-up specials shattered sales records. Beverly Hills Cop rewrote box office assumptions. Coming to America cemented cultural influence. The Nutty Professor proved technical mastery. Shrek extended his voice across generations. Momentum was constant. Expansion was expected. Now expansion has been replaced by preservation. Preservation of health. Preservation of family structure. Preservation of emotional clarity. Aging in Hollywood can feel like erosion. Youth dominates marketing cycles. Social media accelerates attention spans. Streaming platforms shorten cultural memory. But Eddie belongs to a generation that built careers without digital amplification. His legacy is not algorithm-dependent. It is structural. That structural permanence grants him a rare luxury. He can operate selectively. Instead of chasing output volume, he chooses projects aligned with resonance. His later performances reveal restraint rather than frenzy. The hyperkinetic energy of his 20s has evolved into measured confidence. He no longer performs as if trying to secure his place. He performs as someone who knows it is already secured. But that security carries its own emotional complexity. Because once you remove ambition as the primary driver, you are left alone with time. Time highlights absence. Time highlights mortality. Time highlights loss. The death of his brother Charlie Murphy in 2017 altered that relationship with time. Losing a sibling who shared formative trauma is not simply grief. It is disorientation. Charlie remembered the foster homes, the Brooklyn scarcity, the early comedic experiments that were never meant for cameras. He remembered Eddie before the mythology. When Charlie died, Eddie lost a witness to his origin. And that kind of loss does not resolve quickly. It lingers in small moments, when telling stories, when recalling childhood, when laughing at private jokes that no longer have a co-conspirator. Publicly, Eddie maintained composure. Privately, friends observed a shift. Less urgency, more contemplation. Grief often produces recalibration. After decades of operating as a global entertainer, Eddie began emphasizing something radically simple: presence. Not presence as performance, presence as attention. He has spoken about enjoying quiet routines, early mornings, walking, fitness discipline, structured days. There is no chaos narrative attached to him now. No late-night club controversies dominating headlines. No volatility defining relationships. Instead, there is steadiness. With Paige Butcher and their younger children, life appears intentionally grounded. 10 children across different stages of adulthood means that legacy is not abstract. It is lived daily. Birthdays, school events, long conversations. For someone who experienced foster care and instability, building continuity may be the deepest personal victory. Wealth plays a role, but not in the obvious way. His estimated net worth, often cited around $200 million, represents insulation more than indulgence. Real estate holdings in Beverly Hills and beyond function as protective environments. Reports mention a private island in the Bahamas. That sounds extravagant, but psychologically, it symbolizes distance from noise. Space where no one demands performance. Space where laughter is not currency. That distinction defines his later years. The heartbreak embedded in this phase is subtle. It is not tragedy in the dramatic sense. It is the awareness that the world's loudest chapters are behind you. Not because you failed, but because time moves forward. For some performers, that awareness triggers panic. Desperation for relevance. Overexposure. Reinvention attempts that feel forced. Eddie has not exhibited that panic. He appears comfortable allowing younger stars to dominate cultural conversation. Comfortable allowing streaming cycles to spin without him. Comfortable understanding that his influence does not require constant visibility. That comfort suggests emotional resolution. The boy who once feared disappearing if he stopped performing has become a man who understands he does not disappear when he rests. There is a profound psychological evolution in that. Because the original survival mechanism, make them laugh so they keep you, no longer governs him. He does not need the crowd to confirm existence. He does not need constant applause to confirm relevance. He has built something more durable than hype: longevity. At 64, Eddie Murphy's tragedy is not collapse. It is the accumulated weight of decades lived at extraordinary velocity. The childhood losses, the marital dissolutions, the public scrutiny, the sibling death, the cultural expectations. And yet he stands, not explosive, not frantic, not defensive, just standing. Sometimes the most heartbreaking realization is not that a legend has fallen. It is that a legend has aged, softened, and chosen peace over performance. And in a culture addicted to spectacle, that quiet choice may be the most radical act of all. There comes a moment in every extraordinary life when the narrative stops being about ascent and starts being about meaning. For Eddie Murphy, Part B is not a comeback chapter, not a scandal, not a reinvention. It is something far rarer in Hollywood: integration. At 64, Eddie Murphy no longer moves like a man chasing applause. He moves like someone who has already measured it and decided it is not the ultimate currency. The energy that once powered arenas has narrowed into something steadier, more controlled. The laughter remains, but it is no longer defensive. It is no longer armor. When he first entered the world of entertainment, laughter was survival. Foster care, the death of his father, his mother's illness, the instability of Bushwick. Comedy kept rooms safe. It created belonging where structure failed. That instinct carried him through Saturday Night Live at 19, through the seismic success of Beverly Hills Cop, through the cultural dominance of Coming to America, through the layered performance complexity of the Nutty Professor, and into generational immortality via Shrek. But what happens after you have nothing left to prove? For many performers, the answer is fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of aging. Fear of being replaced. Fear of the silence after the roar. Eddie's evolution suggests something different. He did not cling to dominance. He did not flood the market with unnecessary projects. He did not distort himself to chase trends. Instead, he recalibrated his relationship with visibility. Fame became optional rather than compulsory. That shift becomes clearer when examining how he speaks about legacy. Earlier in his career, legacy was box office, cultural footprint, record-breaking deals. Later, legacy became paternal presence, emotional stability, long-term continuity. 10 children reshape the concept of permanence. Influence is no longer abstract, it is domestic. It is visible in how you respond to conflict, how you manage time, how you handle aging. Eddie's later interviews reveal a man more interested in fatherhood than celebrity myth-making. The death of Charlie Murphy intensified this shift. Losing the person who remembered the beginning removes illusion. It reminds you that the only true archive is memory. Without Charlie, Eddie became the sole keeper of their origin story. That responsibility changes how you value time. There is a certain gravity that settles into someone who has survived both poverty and excess. Eddie Murphy has lived on both extremes of cultural experience, from foster homes to private islands, from empty subway rides to global premieres. That duality produces perspective. His estimated net worth, often cited around $200 million, reads impressive. But wealth is no longer spectacle in his life. It is infrastructure. It buys autonomy, privacy, the ability to say no. It buys the luxury of choosing projects like Dolomite Is My Name, not because they guarantee dominance, but because they resonate with identity. And identity is the final battlefield of long fame. For decades, Eddie Murphy's identity was externally reinforced. Funniest man alive, box office king, Hollywood icon. Now his identity appears internally anchored. Father, partner, survivor, elder statesman of comedy. That internal anchoring is the quiet resolution of his tragedy. The heartbreak was never collapse. It was endurance. The weight of carrying cultural joy for 40 years while privately absorbing grief, pressure, public scrutiny, and personal misalignment. The psychological strain of being indispensable at 21. The recalibration after divorce. The responsibility after controversy. The silence after losing a brother. And yet, he did not implode. He did not self-destruct. He did not become a cautionary tale. Instead, he evolved. At 64, Eddie Murphy represents something rare in entertainment. Longevity without bitterness. You do not hear resentment in his tone. You do not sense desperation in his choices. You sense containment. The boy who once feared disappearing if he stopped performing has become the man who understands that presence does not require performance. That realization is profound, because it means the original wound, the fear of being unseen, no longer governs him. He does not need to dominate headlines to feel real. He does not need to explode across screens to validate his existence. He is allowed to be still. And in a culture that confuses noise with value, stillness is radical. So when audiences look at Eddie Murphy today, they may see softened features, measured interviews, fewer projects. They may interpret that as slowing down. But what they're actually witnessing is integration. The Hunger Years integrated with wealth. The survival humor integrated with emotional maturity. The fame integrated with fatherhood. The grief integrated with peace. His life did not resolve into fairy tale perfection. It resolved into balance. And perhaps that is why the story feels beyond heartbreaking in a way that is difficult to articulate. Because it forces us to confront a truth about legends. They are not sustained by applause. They are sustained by adaptation. Eddie Murphy adapted. From foster child to global star, from cultural detonator to quiet patriarch. The world remembers the punchlines. He remembers the cost. And at 64, he finally seems to have chosen something that costs less.